Welcome to episode 82 of the MMA Rundown podcast. Got a handful of things to talk about this week, mostly around the UFC. So we have the main event between Uriah Hall and Anderson Silva that Uriah Hall is able to win by a TKO in the fourth round. I'll recap the rest of that card, talk about UFC Vegas 13, which is coming up, which Dana White may have accidentally kind of sabotaged this card by announcing a fight that I'll also be talking about. Which is the Blachowicz versus Israel Adesanya fight. And there's another fight that I thought was worth mentioning as well, so I'll talk about that. Recap the Bellator 250 event, which was headlined by a fight between their welterweight champion and their middleweight champ, Gegard Mousasi, who was able to win. And then the last thing I'll talk about is something that I've been watching for a little while, and I think this week we've seen enough where I think it's actually worth mentioning, and that is what I think Henry Cejudo's next steps are going to be in his athletic career, or at least where I think he's looking right now. So back to the top, we have the Uriah Hall versus Anderson Silva fight, and this was kind of a tough fight to watch. But on this, and that's as a fan of Anderson Silva. But on the same token, it was also pretty impressive from him. So we're at a point now where Anderson Silva is 45 years old, primarily a striker, was very well known for his speed, and typically when you get older, speed is one of the things that goes first. And he's getting put in there against a top 10 guy in Uriah Hall. And first round, I thought he did enough to edge out that round and win it. Second round was pretty close. I probably lean a little bit towards Hall, but there were people who thought that Silva might have had that. Third round was going fairly well for Silva up until the end of the round. So even though Silva is 45, the fact that he was doing very well in the first three rounds against a top 10 fighter shows how good Anderson Silva still is. With that being said, what was really tough to watch about this is that I was watching Anderson do a fantastic job of setting up shots, particularly with his boxing against Uriah Hall. But then the punches would just be coming in slow, and Hall would be able to kind of react to it just in time to block or get out of the way. It also felt like the punches weren't really as snappy as they used to be. So it's one of those things where it's like, it felt like an older version of Anderson Silva would have taken Hall out and taken Hall out really quickly. But in this fight, every time it seemed as though Silva did a good job of setting a shot up, the shot was just a little bit too slow, and Hall was able to get out of the way. And Silva was keeping his hands down a lot, trying to get out of the way of a lot of shots, but again, I felt like he was a little bit slow on that as well. Plus, his chin is definitely not what it used to be. So it's one of those things where it's like you see a lot of vintage Anderson in this fight, but the difference in age, it really showed, and you can kind of see where maybe an older Anderson's able to land, maybe an older Anderson's able to land harder, whereas this one, a little bit too slow. Hall's able to make an adjustment at the last second, get out of the way, or get his hand up and block a shot, particularly with that left hand of Anderson. Anderson did a good job of drawing Uriah Hall's right hand down, and then coming in hard with the left hand over the top, whether it was an overhand or whatever other type of left hand he was looking for, whether that be a straight. Usually a straight or overhand in this fight. But the punch would just be coming slow enough that Hall would be able to adjust to it, even though Silva did a good job of setting a trap and then throwing the strike. So it's tough because Silva still is a fantastic fighter. He still is a very smart fighter. He's still very good at setting up his opponents. But if he doesn't have the ability to actually land, or if he doesn't have the ability to land as hard as he used to, it makes it tough. So even though he was doing pretty well early in the fight, it's not as though he ever had Hall in a position where it was like close to a finish. But then once Hall started landing on him, obviously, he knocked Silva's down, almost had him finish at the end of the third round. You figure if there's like 30 seconds to go, he might get a finish then. And then the fourth round, again, is able to knock him down, and that time he was able to get the finish on the ground. Silva wasn't able to get a good hold of him and stop the ground and pound, so Hall was able to land enough that the referee had to step in and call a stop to it. So for Uriah Hall, I mean, it's a big name to get a win over. It's a former UFC champion. He was top 10. He's been on a pretty good hot streak lately, so that kind of keeps him going on that hot streak. Middleweight's in a weird spot right now. Even before the announcement that was made that Adesanya was moving up to light heavyweight in his next fight, it was one of those things where it's like the one guy who really seemed to like have locked down a title fight was Robert Whittaker. And when asked if he wants to fight, he's pretty much like, yeah, whatever, if it comes, it comes. But it's not as though he was like really gunning for it. So it seems like there's an opening for someone in the top 10 to get a big win and then to really, really call for a title fight that they could possibly jump ahead really quickly. I don't know that Hall was ever in a position where he could jump into a title fight after this win, but it does feel like there's an opening for that top contender spot at middleweight, especially since the other fight that's being looked at as a top contender fight is between Darren Till and Jack Hermanson. The two of them are both coming off of losses heading into that fight, so the winner is going to have a one-fight winning streak. Do I think that Uriah Hall is now in the title picture? I don't know about that, but he could very well be in a position where he's going to fight the winner of that particular fight, especially if Robert Whittaker is going to take the winner of that. And even if Robert Whittaker takes the winner of that, while Adesanya is up at light heavyweight, the loser of that fight is still a good opportunity for Uriah Hall. So he's in a pretty good spot now, I think. At 36 years old, if he wants to make a run at the title, now's the time to do it. And I don't think he's earned the title shot now where he doesn't have to fight again to get it, but he might be like one fight away, just given where the division's at right now, especially if Whitaker is not going to really push that hard for the title fight. And especially if the UFC is going to wait on Australia and New Zealand to open back up where they can do another 50,000 person stadium. So we'll see where that goes, but this potentially could be a really big one for Uriah Hall in his career. For Anderson Silva, it was talked about beforehand that this was going to be his last fight in the UFC. It sounds like from his standpoint that he wants to keep fighting. Obviously, he was incredibly competitive, if not beating a top 10 UFC middleweight through 3 rounds at this point. So he is obviously still capable of fighting. Is it in the best interest of the UFC to kind of have him floating around and fighting unranked guys? Probably not, and I think it's tough with him, especially seeing him get finished. You don't want to see a legend just look like a pedestrian fighter at the end of his career. This isn't like basketball where Michael Jordan can come back and play for the Wizards and not be the Michael Jordan that everyone remembered, and no one really is like all that upset about it. It feels like in MMA when you have a fighter who's past their prime and they're not performing at the same level they used to. That's a lot worse because of the damage they can take, and you start seeing them take some losses and you sort of forget how good they were. I feel like Anderson Silva, for the longest time, it was like him and GSP were like 1A, 1B. Some people felt like GSP was number one greatest of all time. Some people felt like it was Anderson. And Anderson loses to Chris Weidman, but then it felt like he went on a pretty long run of not having the best performances. Obviously, he's been fighting over the course of the last 5 years, and obviously that's above 40 years old. He's not in his athletic prime anymore, so he wasn't putting on the best performances. People remember those performances. And so it kind of hurt his standing in terms of where he ranks in like the GOAT conversation. We've seen BJ Penn, who was at the very least considered the lightweight GOAT for a long time. Obviously, I think Khabib's done enough to earn that from him now. But after BJ Penn just went on a really long losing streak, people really seem to forget how great he was. So it's kind of tough to see a guy like Anderson not fighting at his best, losing to fighters who otherwise would beat when he was at his best, like Uriah Hall. And I can see why the UFC is like, you know what, like you've had a great run here, like we don't want to promote you anymore. But I can also understand from Anderson's perspective, he loves fighting. He just proved that he can hang in there with some of the best guys in the world, even winning rounds against them. So if he wants to keep fighting, that's up to him as an adult. He can obviously hang in there with some of the best guys. It does feel like if he wants to take another fight, he should be able to. If the UFC doesn't want to promote him, that's fine. There was talk that he has 1 fight left on his contract, and Dana White's not going to honor that. I think written into the contract, they literally have to offer him a fight. So either Dana's going to just like offer him fights that he knows that Anderson's not going to take, just so he can just kill time on that, or he's going to have to offer him a fight, and Anderson is going to take it, and then Anderson will fight for the UFC again. But if that's an option they don't want, then I think they are going to have to release him, at which point Anderson can go somewhere else. Hopefully he goes to another promotion that is maybe a little bit more liberal with their drug testing policies and just kind of lets him take what he feels he needs, and hopefully he gets some matchups that are a little bit more appropriate for where his game's at right now. So if this is it for Anderson in the UFC, it's kind of unfortunate that he goes out on a loss. There is some stuff that he can hold his head up high about, particularly being able to take early rounds against a top 10 guy, but it was just kind of tough to see him have so many opportunities where he would set traps for Uriah Hall and just not be able to make him pay for it. But great fight otherwise, fantastic career otherwise. I liked seeing a lot of people in the MMA community giving him a lot of respect, including other fighters. He's a guy who, for a lot of people, really got them into the sport. Anderson wasn't like my favorite fighter when I was getting into watching UFC, but he was definitely one that I really enjoyed watching. I made sure I could watch every single fight that he was in. Prior to me getting into like training myself, he was something that I watched a lot and really, really enjoyed. So I feel like he definitely played a role for me in terms of my interest in the sport. He was definitely something unique and someone who I enjoyed watching. I know obviously there are a lot of fighters who watched him and he was their inspiration. We heard about Israel Adesanya feeling that way when they fought. Uriah Hall, in his embrace with Anderson after the fight, was pretty much saying the same thing. So he's definitely a guy that will be remembered for a long time. Was one of the greats of the sport. Whether or not people have him in the top 5 of their GOAT conversation still. I mean, if you're going to take people out for drugs, then okay. But if you're not going to do that, I would really hope that people remember Anderson sort of like in his mid-30s and back in his prime, rather than thinking about Anderson when he was 40-plus and losing fights that he otherwise might have won or otherwise should have won back when he was at his best. Rest of the card on the co-main event, I was shocked at the performance by Bryce Mitchell in that I've seen his past fights. Like, he does a decent job of taking guys down. He's got pretty good control from top, good guard passing. But I figured with Andre Fili, this would be a really tough matchup for him. I figured that Fili would be a tough guy to take down, a tough guy to hold down. I just didn't really have as much of an appreciation of Bryce Mitchell's wrestling as I do now after watching this fight. But there was another thing that I really noticed about Bryce Mitchell that was much larger to me, and that is, for whatever reason, and Khabib's been around the UFC for a long time, it feels as though a lot of the best wrestlers, when they take someone down, they go back to what they do typically when they wrestle. And typically when they take someone down, they try to control the arm post, not the leg post. So if I take you down, I'm trying to go for wrist control to try to keep you from like posting up and then getting back up. What Khabib is very well known for is that when he takes you down, he's really good at using his legs to hook your legs to keep you from coming back up. And there aren't a whole lot of other fighters who do that, especially not doing it well. And Bryce Mitchell in this fight, time after time, when he would take Andre Fili down, would quickly use his legs to scoop up Fili's legs, keep him in place. A lot of times he would kind of like hover above, over top of the knee. Then once he felt like he had Fili settled down, he would slide into mount. So there were some things, both from a wrestling standpoint, I was impressed with Bryce Mitchell being able to take Fili down as many times as he was, especially given the fact that Fili's not an easy guy to take down. He's not an easy guy to control. He's trained with a Team Alpha Male, which is just a factory of wrestlers. So for one, just getting all the takedowns that he did was very impressive to me, the way he was able to chain them together. Much better wrestling than I had recalled from Bryce Mitchell, so that was impressive. The way that he controlled from top was relatively unique compared to how most other fighters do it. Obviously, Khabib is very well known for what Mitchell was attempting in that fight, what Mitchell was doing in that fight. But it was still cool to see someone else doing that and doing it very well against a very high-level opponent. So that impressed me. Now, with that being said, one of the things I talk about with Khabib is that oftentimes he'll get to dominant positions like mount or get the back, and then someone will get away, and that was a major problem for Bryce Mitchell in this fight. So that aspect, I think, definitely is something that needs some more work. And when you heard Bryce Mitchell in the post-fight interview sounding disgusted with himself, he definitely saw it the same way, where he's like, yes, I was able to take him down. Yes, I was able to get to dominant positions, but I kept losing those positions. I kept losing mount. I got rolled over a couple times. So he definitely recognizes the areas that weren't going as well for him in this fight. And it sounds like, from what he was saying, that he's better about that in the gym right now anyway. It was just a bad performance. But it's also something that he's going to work on and try to improve moving forward. And he'll definitely need to moving forward once he fights some of the better guys in the division, especially the guys who are more dangerous on the feet. It's going to be important for him to be able to control guys better when they actually do get to the ground, because those opportunities, especially against some of the top guys who are really difficult to take down, they're going to be limited. So you got to take advantage of them when you have them. But otherwise, I found this to be a really impressive performance for Bryce Mitchell. He looked a lot better than what I'd recalled from him in the past. So even though there were the issues of him getting to dominant positions and losing them over and over, how he was able to get there was very impressive to me, and I'm really interested in seeing him moving forward. Also pretty cool for him that he actually got to wear the camo shorts finally, that those were made for him. Looked pretty cool. There were a handful of other fighters who were like, you know what, now that Reebok's made those, I want a pair for myself. We'll see if we start seeing some other guys like Curtis Blades and some of the other ones who were saying that fighting in camo shorts moving forward. But that was also cool. Also, on a weird side note, in the post-fight scrum, I don't remember what he was asked to bring it up, but he went on to like a little bit of a rant about how in Arkansas he's really upset with the legislators there, that they're putting a lot of mask restrictions in place, and was pretty much just saying, like, look, if people want to wear them, they can wear them, but don't like force that down by law. People are going to be upset at me for saying this, but you know what? I pay tens of thousands of dollars a year in taxes. Of course I have a say. Of course my opinion should be heard. I thought that was relatively fair. Obviously, if you are for mask mandates, you're going to dislike what he said. If you're against them, you're going to like what he said. If you're sort of on the fence, I don't know that he said enough to really make you change your mind either way, but I thought that the response to it was relatively interesting. But overall, pretty good fight for Bryce Mitchell. Philly is a very tough guy. I think Max Holloway at one point was asked who his toughest opponent was to get to the title, and I think Philly was number one on the list that Holloway gave, or he was saying that he was like right up there, that people didn't realize how good he was. So for Mitchell to get this win and to get it the way that he did, I think is really impressive, and it tells me that Mitchell is a lot more of a contender than I had previously thought he was. The fight before that, we had Greg Hardy versus Maurice Green. It wasn't the most exciting fight early on. Hardy, kind of typical to what we've seen from him in the past, where he typically just throws like one strike at a time. At least this time, he was starting to like throw one strike to sort of set up the second strike. It's not as though he's still throwing long combinations. That's still something that he has to work his way into. But we were seeing some improvements on the feet from him. But not a lot was done in the first round. I believe he caught a kick and then was able to get on top of Green. From top, I mean, he was just a big guy. He's a tough guy to get your legs around, a tough guy to control, so he was able to land some decent shots from top, but it's not as though his guard passing looked fantastic, or it's not as though it looked like his top control was the most impressive thing ever. But for a heavyweight, it's much easier to look good from top than it is to look good from bottom. We've seen Greg Hardy on bottom against Alan Crowder, and he looked just god-awful. But no one's really taken him down and controlled him much since then, so we don't know how his bottom game's improved. His top game, at least he didn't get caught anything while he was on top, but it's not like that was the most impressive thing I've seen yet either. But then the second round is able to like sort of like land like this lead uppercut / jab. It was like coming like a bit of a weird angle, sort of like a corkscrew jab. But is able to drop Maurice Green from there. Green's trying to get up. Hardy's still pounding on him. They get into like this bit of a weird position where Hardy is like, I can't remember if he had like control of the shoulder, if he had control of one of the arms. But Green wanted to post on that side, but wasn't able to, so he kind of got stuck there for a quick second while he's still trying to work his way back up. Hardy's still landing on him, and at that point, when Herb Dean stepped in, right away, Maurice Green was saying, "Hey, look, I was still moving Herb, like I was still trying to fight his way out." I understand where Green was coming from, but with that being said, he was also taking a lot of shots without dramatically improving the position. He still kind of like had his back given up at that point. Could Herb Dean have given him a little bit more time? Yes, it's not as though Maurice Green was stuck on the ground there because he was like borderline unconscious. It's because Hardy was able to control the posting arm there and keep him from posting and getting up. But either way, big win for Greg Hardy over Maurice Green. For Green, bit of a tough loss. Now he's moved to 9-6, but again, the UFC heavyweight division is not the deepest division, so you can sometimes get away with that, especially since he just had a win over John Vellante. So I don't think he's getting cut or anything. For Greg Hardy, got the win. It was a decent showing. Do I think that he's ready for ranked guys at this point? No. There was that brief moment where he had a couple wins that looked really dominant. I forgot what I think Smolyakov was the guy's name, the lifeguard was his nickname, who was just terrified of him and lost pretty badly. Then Juan Adams had a really bad showing. And at that point, we're like, wow, Greg Hardy just like had these UFC fighters just like completely fearful of him, and Hardy was able to dispatch him pretty easily. Like, is Hardy ready for the top 15? Is Hardy ready for some ranked guys? Did have that fight with Volkov, and Volkov outclassed him on the feet. But again, in this fight, sort of like a middle tier guy, not quite in the top 15 yet. Hardy put on a decent performance. I don't know that he's ready for the top 15 just yet, especially if they think that he's going to win against anyone in the top 15. But decent performance from him. His camp was saying that there were some issues there. Obviously, he almost missed weight, so maybe he was coming in with some injuries that sort of limited what we were able to see from him. But I would just say it's a decent performance out of him. Then we had Kevin Holland versus Charlie Ontoveros. This had a very weird finish. So Holland is sort of behind Ontoveros on the fence, has his arm behind his neck, and then pulls him down onto his back. And at that point, I think there was like a verbal tap from Ontoveros, just saying that he was injured. And it appeared that there was like an apparent neck injury. Now, they took him to the hospital, did some imaging on it, and there wasn't any issue. So then the question is, what exactly happened there? I don't know what exactly happened there. I don't know if Ontoveros has actually given an interview and like said exactly what his experience was, what he felt in the cage, how he was feeling when he went to the hospital, how he even felt before the fight. What I'm going to do right now is give my best assumption as to what happened. I could be spot on. I could be way off. But here's my thinking on it. So if you look at Ontoveros heading into this fight, he had an 11-6 record. I believe he's coming off of back-to-back wins too. So there was a point fairly recently when he was 9-6. If you're a professional fighter and you're 9-6, the odds of you ever making it to the UFC are not particularly high unless you like go on a win streak of like 5 or 6 with all knockouts. At that point, you know what, maybe you've got an outside shot. But typically people with those records don't make it to the UFC. So Ontoveros actually does get a couple of knockout wins. He's moves to 11-6, still not typically a record that's going to get into the UFC. And Kevin Holland's got this fight, I think it was against Mahmoud Muradov. Muradov, like a couple days before the fight, has to pull out. So the UFC's looking for a late replacement. They bring up Ontoveros. And Ontoveros, this guy who probably he's like 15 fights into his career, he's probably thinking, you know what, there's a very small chance of me making it. Actually, I think it's 17 fights. But he's probably thinking, like, there was a small chance of me making it. I have this opportunity now. I might not be in the best of health right now today, but this is an opportunity I can't pass up. If I pass it up, I'm not going to... It's very unlikely I'm going to get another chance like this to fight in the UFC. So he took it. So I think there was a decent chance, just based off of Ontoveros' record and the timing of this, that he likely took this fight compromised. And it's possible that the issue going in was a neck issue. So I've had this... I don't know if you'd consider it an injury per se, but I've had this issue before in the past myself where like my neck will kind of get messed up where there'll be like a pinched nerve. I'm not sure if it's like one of those things where it's like based off of where the spine is, where it just needs to get adjusted back, or if it's just like a swelling muscle where the swelling pinches into a nerve. But it won't last more than like a week. But while it lasts, like my range of motion on my neck will be very limited. Like I can't turn it the full distance, and even if I get close to doing that, even if I get close to turning it the full way, as far as I can, Like, it'll be extremely painful. So my guess is that Ontoveros might have had one of those sort of like pinches into his neck, where his motion was a little bit limited. He goes into this fight, and he may have been pushed past the range of motion, especially with Holland's arm being behind his head, where it kind of like, as he falls back, his like the back of his head and the back of his neck would wrap around the arm. So it could have been one of those things where he had an impingement coming into the fight, getting slammed down, sort of like snapped it past there. It wasn't anything where like the actual vertebrae were hurt there. It could have just been one of those things where like the nerve was already pinched to begin with. Like that put extra pressure on the nerve, which made it like a jolt of pain at the moment. So it might have been one of those things where it's like at the moment he's like, oh my god, what the hell just happened? Like now I'm in extreme pain. So that may have been the reason to call a stop to it right then. But then when they go back and they do some imaging on it, they may find that there wasn't anything like structurally wrong with the actual vertebrae. It could have just been like a nerve thing. So again, that's me taking a guess as to what happened. That would make sense. With that being said, there's plenty of information that I don't know about Ontoveros. I don't know what his side of the story is in terms of how he felt going into the fight, and then what he felt in the fight, and then what he felt afterwards when they were going to the hospital. But to me, that seems like a possibility as to what happened there, and why the fight ended in such an abrupt manner, and he was able to go to the hospital and not have any serious issues when they checked on him. Fight before that, bit of a surprise was Thiago Moises getting a win over Bobby Green, especially after how Moises looked against Michael Johnson. Johnson was eating him up on the feet. Now, with that being said, Michael Johnson was at least willing to set his feet and like throw hard on Moises and had Moises in some serious trouble. Then the second round, Moises dives on a leg and is able to catch him in an ankle lock and get the finish. In this fight, Bobby Green was pretty comfortable on the feet, but he wasn't overly committing to his strikes. So for that reason, he did land some decent shots on Moises, but it wasn't enough where Moises was like having to take any desperation shots on him. Moises was also landing a lot with his right hand. And so, though Bobby Green looked like he was doing okay in the first round, it was one of those things where it's like, on the feet, there isn't as big of a gap as there probably should have been, because Green was pretty worried about getting taken down. And that kept Moises close. When Moises was able to get some takedowns, obviously he put himself in a good spot within the fight. There was a time in the second round, and I think the judges may have actually given the second round to Bobby Green, which was interesting. Green had his best round on the feet in that round, but he also had to fight out of a leg attack from Thiago Moises, where Moises had like his back up against the fence, dove down on a leg, went for a straight ankle lock, tried to pass it over for a heel hook, and then when he was going for the heel hook, lost control of the knee, and Bobby Green was able to get out. But on the feet, again, Moises was still landing some pretty hard punches. Green, he looked comfortable, but for as cocky as he appeared, and I don't mean cocky as in like he was overconfident, it's just like that's his fighting style, where he keeps his hands down, he tries to draw shots out of you, then he tries to get out of the way and counter you. It's a tactic thing. I don't think it's like a overconfidence thing or anything. But for as much as he was employing that tactic, he wasn't really landing a whole lot compared to Moises, who was able to land a little bit more, especially with that right hand. So Moises was able to win a decision here, 2-1. I didn't have any issue with that decision. I thought it was about right. So big win for him. Now he's going off of wins over Bobby Green and Michael Johnson, so both pretty big names, guys who've been in the UFC for a while. On the prelims, we had Alexander Hernandez versus Gritsmacker. Gritsmacker typically wrestles guys down and grinds them out. Hernandez has a decent wrestling background, not the easiest guy to take down. And so on the feet, Gritsmacker, relatively slow striker, versus Hernandez, who's much more explosive. Hernandez has made a pretty big name for himself, pretty much just for taking a short notice fight on Beneil Dariush, exploding into him and landing a huge shot that ended up leading to a knockout. And getting that knockout over Dariush put him in the rankings, gave him some opportunities for a little while, had that fight with Cerrone. Ultimately lost that fight to Drew Dober, which put Dober in the rankings and took Hernandez out. But here, that same explosiveness that got him into the rankings in the first place was used against Gritsmacker. Was able to land a lot of shots, was a lot quicker to the punch than Gritsmacker was. As a result, hurts him up against the fence, lands a nice little combo to finish him off and gets the win. Adrian Yanez versus Victor Rodriguez. Yanez just looks to be the much quicker, much better striker than Rodriguez, was able to pick him apart. A couple different times he would sort of like get Rodriguez to tilt his head in a direction, then he'd try to throw a head kick and catch him. For the most part, Rodriguez was blocking those, but after he had him hurt up against the fence, was able to get him to run away and then run into a head kick that ended up knocking him out for good. So big win for Yanez. Looked really impressive there. Sean Strickland versus Jack Marshman. Strickland was the much more technical striker and was able to pretty much piece up Marshman on the feet. Got the win there by unanimous decision. Cole Williams, I think this is his second UFC fight, ended up missing weight again. Doesn't have a great showing. Gets arm triangled by Jason Wood in the second round. Dustin Jacoby versus Justin Ledette was a pretty fun fight that I'd mentioned last week. Between strikers, you had Ledette, who is more of a boxer, versus Jacoby, who is a kickboxer in glory. And Jacoby definitely used those kicks to set up some pretty big punches. Was giving Ledette a lot of problems before eventually knocking him out of against the fence. And then Miles Johns landed in just a huge uppercut, I believe. But huge knockout against Kevin Natividad. So that covers it for this fight card. As far as what's coming up next, and again, I mentioned this at the start. This is something I'm going to talk about in the next topic, but I'm just going to briefly mention it right now. The expectation going into this particular card is that the Santos versus Teixeira fight was the number one contenders fight, and the winner would be fighting against Jan Blachowicz, especially if it's Thiago Santos, given that he has a knockout win over the current champion in Blachowicz. And so going in, if we all were under the assumption, hey, this is a number one contenders fight, I think it would be a little bit more interesting. But with that being said, by announcing that Israel Adesanya will be fighting Jan Blachowicz, it sort of takes that away. So the winner will still kind of be like floating around in the top contender space, but they're probably going to have to fight again because, let's be real, if Jan Blachowicz loses to Israel Adesanya, the next fight for the light heavyweight title will likely be Israel Adesanya defending his light heavyweight title against Jon Jones. So by the time that happens, it's probably going to be like in the summer. Then the next time that he'd be able to defend that title is probably going to be like this time next year, if not later. So the winner of the Santos versus Teixeira fight is probably not going to be fighting for a title next, as had initially been anticipated. But it's still a really good fight, and it's going to, for the winner, it's going to be huge. If Santos gets the win, then he kind of moves above the rest of the pack as a top contender. Maybe he fights once or twice, but for the next opening for someone not named Jon Jones or Israel Adesanya for the light heavyweight title, I guess in theory, if Jan Blachowicz wins over Israel Adesanya, maybe he does not fight Jon Jones next. Maybe Jon Jones still keeps his eye on heavyweight at that point. So I guess that's an opportunity as well, where Santos might still be able to wait like 6 months and then fight against Jan Blachowicz if Blachowicz gets the win over Israel Adesanya. So we'll see about that. But either way, this is still a really good fight at light heavyweight. Santos, I believe the one loss that he has at light heavyweight, if I can remember correctly, was to Jon Jones. I think he's won every other fight, including the fight over Jan Blachowicz. The fight with Jon Jones was a pretty competitive fight. I know a lot of people thought that Santos won that fight. I'm not among those people. There's like this thought that Santos just like stepped on a banana peel, and that's how he ended up like tearing up both of his legs. First leg got torn up by leg kicks from Jon Jones. Then when he was heavy on the other leg, that was his better leg, Jon Jones was attacking that one and tore that one up too. So that was just Jon Jones' leg kicks being effective. With that being said, Glover Teixeira's leg kick game is nowhere near the same level as Jon Jones. I don't see him trying to play that game. I think he's going to try to box with Santos and possibly try to get him up against the fence, take him down, and control him. We have seen in the past that Santos has had trouble with guys who are really good on top. Gegard Mousasi gave him a lot of problems where he was able to take him down pretty early and then pound him out from top. The assumption from Glover, I'm sure, would be that his best bet in this fight is going to be to get the takedown early, get on top, either pass, work his way towards mount, and then try to get an arm triangle like he does with a lot of his opponents, or be able to posture up and get some good ground and pound where he's able to get a finish that way. For Santos, he's going to want to keep it on the feet. I don't think he's going to mind boxing with Teixeira too much. Teixeira is relatively slow. Like, he's still pretty powerful with his shots, but he's not the quickest. Santos has some decent counters. Obviously, in that Blachowicz fight, we saw him sort of bait Blachowicz in with a big shot, sort of slipped out of the way and then landed a lead hook of his own that was able to knock him down. I could see him trying to create a similar opening against Teixeira. But for me, it seems like if you're Glover Teixeira, if you're going to be effective with your boxing, it's going to be because you were able to establish the threat of your wrestling first, and if not, Thiago Santos should have the edge in this fight and should be able to win by knockout. In the co-main event, we have Andre Olofsky versus Tanner Bozer. Bozer's been really hot this year. I think he's won his last 3 fights. If not 3, it's been 2. But he's looked pretty good and gotten finishes both times, or all 3 times, depending on how many it's been. I can't remember off the top of my head. Olofsky's got a big name still, former UFC champion. Not exactly the most impressive win. Sometimes when you beat a former UFC champion, you're beating a guy who's still like at the top of the division. Sometimes when you beat a former UFC champion, you're fighting a guy like Andre Olofsky, who isn't even necessarily top 15 in a weight class that isn't all that deep, but still a pretty big opportunity for Bozer anyway. Then we've got Raoni Barcelos versus Khalid Taha, not particularly familiar with either of them. Ian Heinisch versus Brendan Allen's a really good fight at middleweight. This one arguably could have been the co-main event on this card. Allen, I believe, got that win over Kyle Dawkins. Was it Kyle or Chris? I think Chris is the heavyweight, the 2 brothers. But he had that really good fight with Dawkins. I thought that he was done for the year after that, especially after the damage he took in that, but was able to get back on an early November card. He'll be fighting Ian Heinisch, former top 15 middleweight, pretty good wrestler, pretty strong on the feet as well. So it'll be interesting to see how this fight goes. Allen's very good on top, very good at taking guys down and controlling from top. I don't know that he'll be able to do that against Heinisch. So this may end up being more of a striking match, and if that's the case, both these guys are pretty dangerous and pretty strong on their feet as well. Then we've got Yan Xiaonan fighting Claudia Gadelha. Obviously, we're all very familiar with Claudia, former title challenger, has looked pretty solid in her last few fights. Her striking's definitely looked better than it has in previous fights. The jiu-jitsu still, she still, when she gets her takedown, she isn't the best at advancing position and setting up submissions, but she can still win rounds while she's on top. So it'll be interesting to see if that's what she looks to do against Xiaonan. But her striking has improved a lot over time, so it's also possible that she may just have some success on the feet as well. Xiaonan, 12-1, pretty good Chinese prospect. With Zhang Weili being the champion, a lot of people look at Xiaonan as sort of like the Islam Makhachev to her Khabib Nurmagomedov. I don't know if that's the most apt comparison, but that's one that I've heard. But she's still a pretty good prospect, and if she gets the win here, she'll obviously find herself ranked pretty high in the division as well. On their prelims, we got Sarah Moores versus Vanessa Mello. Not the most exciting fight. Records are 6-7 for Moores versus 10-8 for Mello. We got Trevin Giles versus Vaughn Lewis. One of the interesting things about Vaughn Lewis is that he looked really good on the Contender Series. His debut was against Uriah Hall, who obviously we just mentioned for beating Anderson Silva. And Vaughn Lewis was winning that fight against Uriah Hall. He won the first 2 rounds, and then Hall was able to catch him in the 3rd round and knock him out. So Lewis has a high upside. It just feels like he hasn't quite been able to reach that in the UFC. Trevin Giles is a difficult opponent, so we'll see how he looks in this fight. But Lewis is just kind of like one of those wild cards where it's like at his best he can hang with some of the better guys in the division, but it seems like he's been slipping up in his UFC, at least within the octagon. Prior to that, obviously he was undefeated, but in his UFC career, it feels like he's been slipping up more than he should be, and hasn't really been fighting to the best of his abilities. Then we got Alexander Romanov versus Marcos Hajiro de Lima. Romanov, a 12-0 heavyweight, versus Hajiro de Lima, who's been hanging around that division for a while. Darren Elkins will return against Eduardo Garagori. I think Elkins' last fight was against Nate Landwehr. Garagori, really good Argentinian fighter. Recently suffered his first loss of his career. Is now 13-1, but this should still be a pretty fun fight. Garagori more of a striker. Elkins will be looking to take him down and control him. We got Max Griffin versus Ramij Brahimaj. Not familiar with him. And then Felipe Corrales versus Gustavo Lopez. So that covers it for the upcoming fight card. As I was briefly mentioning before, I'll dig a little bit deeper into it now. There were 2 big fights that I feel like are worth mentioning that were announced this week. So the first one is that light heavyweight title fight that'll be between Jan Blachowicz and Israel Adesanya. The other one is a pretty good fight at heavyweight between Cyril Gane and Junior Dos Santos. But for that first one, Jan Blachowicz versus Israel Adesanya, I think the reason why they announced it right now, even though it didn't make the most sense and that it kind of undercuts the upcoming fight, is that Adesanya, who lives in Australia, actually came out to Vegas and was at the UFC Apex for this particular fight card. He obviously has a lot of reverence for Anderson Silva back when they fought, but with this being Anderson Silva's final UFC fight, and that was everyone's understanding going into the fight, he wanted to be there to see it, and the UFC was able to allow him to come in and spectate. So while they already had him, I guess they were talking to him and trying to work some business out, and they were able to work out that fight with Jan Blachowicz. I don't know that it's been signed yet, but it just seems as though they've like agreed upon it in principle. Now they just need to find a date. As far as how I think this fight's going to go, Blachowicz, he's obviously going to be much bigger than a lot of the guys that Adesanya's fought. Now he has fought some big guys. He fought Paulo Costa, who's basically a light heavyweight. He fought against Yoel Romero, who's also very large for the division and even missed weight for one of his initial, pretty much the only title fight he's won was the one against Luke Rockhold, but ended up missing weight by a pound, and as a result ended up not getting a belt wrapped around his waist that night, which I'm sure if Yoel Romero ends his career without a UFC title, that's going to be something that really he's really going to be kicking himself for. So he has fought some bigger middleweights and done pretty well with them and not really had much of an issue with the size. So I don't know that Jan Blachowicz' size is going to be a major issue for him either. Blachowicz, you would think, is going to want to get this fight to the ground. Blachowicz is a pretty good black belt. So for him, his advantage would probably be if he's able to get this fight to the ground, get on top of Izzy, land some solid strikes, kill some time while he's on top. If he can pass guard, great. If he can get to a dominant position and even like find a finish, that's great. But if he can just get on top and land some ground and pound from top, both in terms of having the threat for that in future rounds and also being able to eat up minutes and win rounds while he's doing it, that'd be good for him. On the feet, obviously, he has the power to land on Israel Adesanya. I don't know that he's going to be the best about setting up shots. I think for as long as this fight takes place on the feet, and I think it's going to for the most part, I don't know that I see Jan Blachowicz being effective in taking Adesanya down. Israel should have a pretty big edge here. I don't know that he's going to like one punch or anything, but I think he's going to be able to pick him apart for a while, and eventually, upon accumulation, start to find some openings and be able to put Blachowicz away. I mentioned when Blachowicz won the title that I felt like he was the kind of guy where he's probably not going to hold the title for any more than just the fight that he had against Dominic Reyes. Now, granted, beating Dominic Reyes, especially the way that he did, was very impressive and it's worth a lot of credit. But when you look at some of the other guys who were in the top of the division, whether it was the likely Thiago Santos fight that would have been coming up for him next, John Jones, or I guess even now in this case with Adesanya, I just don't know that I favor him in any of those matchups. So I do think Israel Adesanya, assuming he gets this fight, is going to be the middleweight and light heavyweight champion at the same time, which is really cool. Obviously, it'd be a little cooler if he was able to earn that title by beating John Jones, but Jones gave up his title, and Blachowicz earned that title, so it's still fair game. But again, if he does get that win, then it would seem to make sense that John Jones being the next fight would make a lot of sense. The timing on it's going to be interesting because once, assuming that they do make the heavyweight title fight between Ngannou and Stipe, if John Jones is supposed to go up and fight for the heavyweight title right away, I don't know if he's going to get to a point where he's just like put on enough mass where he's not going back down to 205 no matter what. If he feels like he can kind of stop what he's doing and work his way back down to 205 with a couple months' notice regardless. But it seems like there is a small possibility, depending on how the heavyweight division times itself out and how the fight goes and when it goes down, that Jones just might not be available for 205 anyway, and they might have to like meet at like 215 or somewhere in between. But assuming that's not the case, and we do get John Jones versus Israel Adesanya in 2021, that's going to be a hell of a fight. And it's one of those ones where it's like I feel like I have no place trying to break it down right now in November of 2020, just because of a lot of the improvements that we've seen from Israel Adesanya. I still feel like there's a lot that we didn't get to see in that Costa fight because there really wasn't much grappling involved. So we didn't get to see what kind of improvements have been made in the grappling game, but we have seen from past fights that Adesanya has shown grappling improvements fight to fight. Plus, there's going to be still like 8, 9, 10, potentially more months until that John Jones fight happens, assuming that it does. So it's sort of tough to tell what current Izzy's abilities are, what future Izzy's abilities are, so it makes it tough to break that fight down. But if that is a fight that happens, that'll definitely be one that a lot of people are going to want to see, and I hope that it sells really well. Other fight to mention was Junior Dos Santos versus Ciryl Gane. This is going to be interesting. I feel like Dos Santos, if he loses this fight by knockout, is going to be finding himself in a similar position to Anderson Silva, where the UFC's like, look, like you can still hang with some of the top guys at heavyweight, but we're just seeing you take too many really bad losses here. You're getting finished too much. So we aren't comfortable promoting you anymore. There was some talk about that anyway with Dos Santos' last fight. But I think a knockout loss to Gane here really cements that, and he may be sort of looking in a similar fashion to Anderson Silva, maybe looking for another promotion to be in. I don't know whether or not he wants to get juiced up wherever else he goes or find a place that would be a little more friendly to that, but the UFC might not be open to promoting his fights if he takes a knockout loss here. Gane is pretty good on the feet. On the ground, he's very strong, and he's like been able to physically overwhelm some people. Not exactly the most technical guy. I don't know that I see him submitting Junior Dos Santos, unless it's like one of those ones where he like knocks him down, and then Dos Santos kind of gives his neck up because he'd rather lose that way than by getting pounded out. But in terms of like actually like outwitting Dos Santos on the ground and like setting up a really nice submission and catching him, that's something I don't see that happening. So this fight's probably going to take place on the feet for the most part. Dos Santos he's got some hard leg kicks, so that may be something that he uses in this fight. But I see him looking to land like 1 or 2 punches at a time and hopefully set something up where he's able to drop Gane. But this will be a big test for Ciryl Gane. Dos Santos is still dangerous on the ground, or dangerous on the feet. He does have that option of taking his opponent down and controlling him on the ground like he did with Tuivasa. So maybe he looks to do that against Ciryl Gane. So it's a good test for him. If he gets the win, then I do think he should be ranked after that, and we should start seeing some tougher tests for him. For Junior Dos Santos, fighting a big prospect here, if he's able to get the win, then that kind of proves that he can still hang with some tough guys. Granted, Gane would have been the most proven guy at that point because he wouldn't have like a giant win over a big name. But it still showed that Dos Santos deserved to be around and deserves to have at least a couple more fights in the UFC. So it's going to be a pretty consequential fight for both of them, and I'm definitely interested in seeing how it goes. Next thing to talk about is Bellator 250. So they had their card, very small card. Only ended up having like 5 fights on the card, I believe. In the main event, they had Gegard Mousasi versus Douglas Lima. A fight between Mousasi, the middleweight champion, or now current middleweight champion. He had lost his title to Lovato, who had to give it up after finding some brain issues. And then Douglas Lima, the welterweight champion. Mousasi looked very good on the feet, was able to get some takedowns on Lima. And with Lima, in the past, the fight that people most remember him having difficulty with was Ben Askren, where he took him down and just controlled him the whole time. And we haven't really seen people do that to him recently, so the assumption was that that's just not something that people are going to be able to do. Mousasi was pretty effective at it. Granted, Mousasi's style of control from top is much different than Askren's, but he was pretty effective when he was able to get on top. Lima wasn't able to get up immediately or threaten all that much off his back, so Mousasi was able to win some rounds from top. On the feet, he was relatively competitive. Lima did land some pretty hard leg kicks, but Mousasi was able to take him and keep moving forward. So big win for Gegard. He gets his title back. For Lima, got to give him credit. He took a shot at a championship a weight class above. fought a competitive fight, just unfortunately wasn't enough to get the win there for him. Co-main event was Brandon Girtz versus Henry Corrales. Really close fight, ends up going to a split decision. I think the bigger story here was what happened with Brandon Girtz on the scale. So Mike Mazzulli, I don't know what the hell his issue was, but Girtz is on the scale just in his underwear. Guy reading the scale says 146, which is fine. He has a 1 pound allowance at 145. He made weight. So then as Girtz is walking away, Mazzulli's just like yelling at him for no apparent reason, and like decides that he's just arbitrarily going to change the weight. He's like, no, actually, you didn't make 146. You got to make one. You were 146.25. You got to go back on the scale, but this time you got to take your pants off. So then they like put the sheet in front of him. Girtz takes his pants off, makes the weight, and it's just kind of like this bizarre moment where it's like you just said that he made weight. Now you're like being very aggressive with him in a manner that just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense here. Girtz eventually does it, takes his pants off, gets on the scale, makes weight, but it just seemed like such a bizarre circumstance. I don't know what the hell Mazzulli was yelling about. If it was just a misunderstanding where he actually was at 0.25 and they just read it wrong the first time, it just feels like that was poorly communicated, so I don't know what the hell happened there, but it was a really bad look for Mazzulli. Girtz, I guess, just kind of put up with it because Mazzulli was the guy in charge there, but it was a really weird moment, and a lot of people weren't particularly happy with how Mazzulli handled it, myself included. On the prelims, we had Johnny Eblen getting a decision win over Taylor Johnson. Saba Hamasi landed a huge knee on Bobby Volker and was able to finish him on the ground really quickly. And then in a really ugly fight, we had Brandon Carlton versus Jake Hager. Hager, pretty much in this fight, in case anyone was wondering if he had like a future as being a contender at heavyweight, obviously, as I mentioned many times, heavyweight's a very shallow division. Obviously, Hager spent most of his adult life as a professional wrestler, but he did have a really good background as a collegiate wrestler. Was one of those guys who was an All-American, top of the country, one of those guys who would give Cain Velasquez trouble back in their college wrestling days. So you were kind of wondering, okay, well, he does have that wrestling base. He still has a lot of the knowledge that he had back when he was an All-American. Still in very good shape. I wonder how far he can go. And was not able to get a single takedown in this fight, at least not that I can remember. There were a lot of moments where he had Carlton up against the fence and was sort of like hunched over, and rather than like, it was weird because it felt like he could have taken him down, and he was just kind of like trying to lean on him and like drag him down rather than like switching off to a different takedown and chaining something together. I don't know if he felt like Carlton was too heavy to like pick up in any way. It was just weird how he would just kind of like stay draped over him in that position and not try to chain to something else, but wasn't able to get any takedowns. So for the most part, this fight had to take place on the feet. His punches appeared to have no power at all. Wasn't really throwing too many combinations. Was taking a lot of shots. Was getting pretty close to getting finished, I believe, in the second round. But did just enough. In the first round, he was at least controlling position enough to win that round. The second round, he definitely lost. The third round, sort of surged late in it to steal the round and win a split decision. So while he is 3-0, while he definitely showed some toughness in being able to survive a lot of trouble against Carlton, the fact that he wasn't able to get a takedown and the fact that his punching power looks so weak, especially as a heavyweight, doesn't necessarily bode well for his future. But if he wants to keep taking fights and then Bellator's willing to pay him, then I guess that's what they're willing to do. It is worth mentioning for Bellator that they made a really large list of cuts. I don't have the list in front of me, but it included names like AJ Agazarm, I believe the guy who beat Gallagher, what was his name? Bandejas, I think he was on that list as well. Roy Nelson, Frank Mir. A lot of guys were cut off. There were the guys like the AJ Agazarms, the guys who had good backgrounds in wrestling or good backgrounds in jiu-jitsu that they wanted to test out. So we saw some guys like that cut. We saw like the Frank Mirs and the Roy Nelsons, guys who had big names, who had great MMA careers, but weren't exactly at their best right now. They were getting cut. It felt like Bellator was cutting a little bit of every type of fighter. So it's interesting to see what their thought process is on that. I guess they weren't able to offer a lot of fights this year with the pandemic. So maybe that's part of it. Obviously, they're not able to sell any tickets right now, so they're missing a revenue stream from the live event and the live gate. So maybe it's just a cost-cutting thing for them, but it seems like if they're starting to get out of the business of some of those guys, you wonder if a guy like Jake Hager is someone they're going to keep around a whole lot longer, especially if they feel like he's never going to be a guy who's going to contend for a title anyway, and he's just someone you keep around as like a big name, because it still feels like, especially if you're going to have him fight under the name Jake Hager and not under Jack Swagger. I mean, at least with the UFC, Phil Brooks fought at CM Punk. Like, if you're just kind of bringing him in on his own, like, hey, he's a former Division I All-American wrestler, let's see what he can do. I think after this fight, you're kind of wondering if he's ever really going to make that much noise in the heavyweight division in Bellator. Last thing to talk about is Henry Cejudo. So Henry Cejudo is constantly tweeting about all different kinds of stuff, and it's one of those things where it kind of becomes like a boy who cried wolf thing, where it feels like when you say, oh, I'm going to do this, I'm going to go for this title, I'm going to go for that title, when it's clear that you're not going to do it, it's hard to know what to believe and what not to believe. And it feels like every time there's a flyweight title fight going on, Henry Cejudo puts his name in the mix. Whenever there's something with the bantamweight title, he puts his name in the mix. Whenever there's something with the featherweight title, he puts his name in the mix. And it also felt like whenever there's something Olympic wrestling related, he put his name in the mix. And you're just like, look, dude, you're retired right now. Like, I don't really see you doing any of that. But it felt like if there was any of those four that he would potentially be looking at, it would probably be either 145 or 135 in the UFC, because at least there he's going to get paid a substantial amount of money. Some of the UFC is willing to play ball with him. And it's an opportunity for him to put on a great accomplishment, especially 145, where he could be a three-weight champion. It felt like the bottom of that list would have been Olympic wrestling, given that the Olympics don't pay you anything. Best bet for you is that you actually win it all, and then there's Living the Dream Fund, which is basically a charity that'll pay you $250,000. But Henry can make a lot more than $250,000 for a lot less work if he's fighting in the UFC. He already has an Olympic gold medal, so it's kind of like, well, what would the point of Olympic wrestling be? But with that being said, there was a time, I think a month or two ago, where he put up a picture of him in a wrestling room in front of like the Olympic ring, saying that, hey, 2021, I'm coming. And it's like, yeah, sure, whatever. This week, I am not, yeah, sure, whatever on that anymore. So there have been some stories that have come around that the guy who was on the U.S. national team in 2019, Dayton Fix, and obviously to be on the national team, you have to beat all the other guys at your weight. This was at 57 kilograms, which is the weight class that Henry Cejudo won the Olympics at. That's around 125 pounds. That apparently Cejudo did wrestle with him in the room after he made that team, and Cejudo apparently got the better of those rounds. So if this is true, I'm sure he's under the impression that at least if he could make 57 kilograms, that he could hang with the best guys in the country right now. And so if that's a thought for him, it seems as though this week he really wanted to further investigate that. So the Hawkeye Wrestling Club and the University of Iowa, obviously they're connected together. The Hawkeye Wrestling Club is the wrestling club that is based out of Iowa City and is very much tied in with the Iowa Wrestling Club, or the Iowa's with Iowa's program. They have an event that is going on today that is going to showcase a lot of their guys. So they've got some guys on the Iowa team, like Spencer Lee is going to be on there against Zach Sanders. They got Bryce Meredith going against Austin DeSanto. They've also got a lot of the guys in the Iowa team who are fighting on the undercard. It seems like they're kind of doing wrestle-offs at that point. And it would kind of make sense, I guess, for Henry Cejudo, who's from Arizona, who's very much into wrestling, to come out on Saturday or come out on Sunday just to watch it. And maybe if he comes out a day early, he can hang with the club, maybe watch him train, maybe even like train with him for a day. He's very good friends with Terry Brands. Brands was his coach back when he was in the Olympics back in 2008 when he won it all. So maybe like kind of spending some time with him. Okay, that would make sense. That wasn't the case that it was a Saturday or Sunday thing. He was, at the very least, in Iowa City on Monday, the week of. So that means he's been in Iowa City for almost for like a full week at this point at least. I knew of him being in Iowa City on Monday because he went to a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school out there called Citadel BJJ. That's very much tied in with the wrestling program as well. But he was there, like, taking pictures. I don't believe he was training there, but at least he was, like, there in Iowa City. And again, for a guy who lives in Arizona, what would he be doing in Iowa City for an entire week, leading into just kind of like this small wrestling event that wasn't even, like, big enough for me to cover on this show, and I do cover wrestling. Why is he spending the entire week there? So that was sort of in the back of my head. And then as the week goes on, he posts a picture of him after a workout with Terry Brands in the Iowa wrestling room. Then he posts a picture of him with Spencer Lee in the wrestling room. And why that's very relevant is that the top guys at 57 kilograms right now for the USA are Dayton Fix, the guy who I mentioned before. It's Thomas Gilman, who was with the Hawkeye Wrestling Club for a while, recently just moved to Pennsylvania to be with the Penn State Wrestling Club. And Spencer Lee, who is a two-time national champion, likely would have won the national title had COVID not taken that tournament out. But he's the 125-pounder for the University of Iowa right now, and is considered a top guy for that 57-kilogram spot for the 2021 Olympic team. And so it seems pretty obvious that Henry Cejudo was training with Spencer Lee. So the question then becomes, if Henry Cejudo is going to spend an entire week in Iowa City while it's cold in Iowa City, leading up to an event that isn't even that big of an event, it seems as though either he is fully committed to doing the Olympics in 2021, or he is really going to test himself out right now. And so he wants to get in the room against a guy like Spencer Lee, another guy who's a top contender at 57 kilograms, and see how he stacks up to him. And depending on how that goes, if Spencer Lee feels like, or if Cejudo feels like he can beat Spencer Lee, or if he was beating Spencer Lee in the room, and maybe that confirms to him, hey, I am at that level right now, that it is possible that Cejudo is going to make a run in 2021 for the Olympic team. Now, it is worth mentioning that weight is 125 pounds. Cejudo had a hard time making 125 in an MMA where there was the day before weigh-in. I don't believe there is a day before weigh-in in wrestling. So it seems like if he is going to go for the Olympics, 65 or 57 kilograms might not be the best option for him. He might have to go up to 65, which I think is like 143 pounds, which is a higher weight. Now, with that being said, the 65 kilogram weight class hasn't had a ton of success internationally for the United States. They've got a couple of really good guys at the top of that weight class right now. I guess they've got three really good guys. They've got Jordan Oliver. They've got Yanni Giacomo, who at least has wins over the number one guy in Bajrang Punia. And they've also got Zane Rutherford, who hasn't been as successful internationally, but has wins over Yanni. Was able to earn the spot for Team USA at that weight class the last time around. So maybe Henry Cejudo would be looking at that as another option as well. But the fact that he was spending an entire week in Iowa City, where it's not like there's anything else for him to do other than to be training wrestling and to be hanging around the wrestling program, tells me that at the very least he is seriously considering making a run in 2021 in the Olympics, which is surprising to me because, again, the money that the Olympics are going to pay is way less than what he could be making in the UFC. It's not as though winning a second Olympic gold medal would be the most amazing. I mean, it's obviously a fantastic thing. He was able to take that much time away from wrestling, basically take 13 years off between his last Olympics and then this one and actually win it all. But it does seem like he is seriously, like, he's taking some serious steps that go beyond just, like, putting out an obnoxious tweet. Like, it seems as though he's actually putting an effort to, at the very least, test the waters and see where he stands against some of the top guys in the country right now. That's at the very least, but possibly more than that is that he actually is committing to it and he's going to actually make a run at an Olympic team in wrestling. So, assuming that this is the case and assuming that we're actually going to see Henry Cejudo doing some competitions, like doing a U.S. Open or competing to earn a spot on the U.S. Olympic team, that's going to be huge for the sport of wrestling. I think there are going to be a lot of MMA fans who are still not to the point where they're watching wrestling. They kind of recognize some former wrestlers who've come into the MMA space. But to have a guy like Henry Cejudo, who retired as a champion, who is still in his athletic prime, competing in some big U.S. wrestling tournaments, I think it could bring a lot of eyes to it, and it could be really big for the sport. So both for Henry, it'll be interesting to see how far he can go with this, but then also for the sport of wrestling, it'd be a huge opportunity if you have Henry Cejudo going for an Olympic spot right now. While a lot of people still consider him to be the best guy at 135, who just happens to not be actively fighting. So that'll be fun to watch for. I'm going to keep a closer eye on this. I think if Henry Cejudo makes any comments about returning to MMA, I'm still going to be like, yeah, sure, like, I'll believe it when I see it. But I think at this point, based on his actions this week, I have reason to believe that anything Henry Cejudo says about interest in wrestling, there's actually reason to believe it and actually reason to, like, give it some credence. Because it just seems unusual for him to spend an entire week in Iowa City when it's cold, when it's getting cold out there, when there's, like, some snow flurries, when there's not a whole lot to do other than just wrestle. It sure seems like wrestling is on his mind, and 2021 is seriously a thought for him, as something for him to do athletically. So that covers it for this week. Obviously, next week I'll be recapping the UFC Vegas 13 card, which will be headlined by Thiago Santos and Glover Teixeira, and then previewing the pay-per-view that'll be coming up the week after. And then I'm sure plenty of other stuff will come up along the way. I don't know if we're going to have any more updates on Henry Cejudo. Maybe I'm missing something right now, or maybe he's getting interviewed and he's about to make an announcement that he's going to go for it in 2021. I don't know about that, but I am very much interested in this Henry Cejudo story now, and it's definitely something I'll be watching very closely because it does. I do get the feeling that if he doesn't go for the Olympic team, it's going to be because he felt something in the room where he's like, yeah, I don't have it anymore. But if he's doing well in these workouts, it does seem like the logical next step for him and something that he'd be willing to do is to take a run at the Olympic team in 2021, which it'd be very fascinating to see. So that covers it for this week, and I'll talk to you guys next week.